All right, welcome to the very last meeting for Gateway API in September of 2024. It's September 30 here in California, at least. And I've got a very light agenda today, just talking about the 1.2 release, which is, I would describe imminent. We have a few notes on that, but always feel free to add anything else to the agenda. I expect we'll probably get some time back at the tail end of this. Um, But yeah, I guess I'll also give the standard reminder that this is a Kubernetes community meeting. Be nice to each other, follow Kubernetes code of conduct, and also in the odd chance there are any new faces or people that want to introduce themselves, by all means, jump in. Happy to hear what brings you here. No pressure, but give a minute or two if anyone wants to introduce themselves.
Yeah, and also anyone else who would like to add stuff to the agenda, I've just popped the agenda link in the chat. Please add anything else you might want to talk about. And yes, if you could also add yourself to the attendees list, that would be very good. Thanks.
Cool. All right. Well, with that, let me jump right in. This will be really quick. RC2 went out last week, Thursday, my time. Nick actually released this. So the main change, and this is a big one, is that well, actually, there's two. One was fixing a thing where if you're overriding Conformance Suite client options, that wasn't working well in RC1. That's fixed now in RC2. The other major change is that gRPC route and reference grant have v1 alpha 2 disabled. That will be something where, like, particularly with gRPC route, if you had a controller sitting around that was reading and writing v1 alpha 2, it is time to move on to v1. So keep that one in mind. Reference grant has v1 alpha 2 has been deprecated for, I want to say, since 0.6, a very long time anyways in Gateway API land. So anyone who had been using it would have been getting warnings for a very long time. gRPC route, it was just deprecated in the previous release. There was a Slack thread about this where we ultimately decided that we should just disable these versions in this coming release, and so that's what we've ended up doing. Yeah, so
Yeah,
just watch out for that one.
I think there's two caveats there. Firstly, as it says in the RC2 changelog, we will have instructions on how to make sure that what people who have been using v1 alpha 2 can do to ensure that their records are persisted to v1 objects inside the Kubernetes data store, so that you in general, if you've been touching them and changing them, then they probably will have been auto converted by the API server for you. But as always, there are plenty of edge cases that make it not 100% guaranteed. It is possible to not have managed to skip that happening if you did exactly the right combination of things. So yeah, we'll have some instructions on how to ensure that that's good if you have been using v1 alpha 2 before installing Gateway API v1 2. The other one is I've been just tidying up a bunch of outstanding GEP stuff. There was a few things like the mesh GEP was originally, the GEP document that was on the site was originally written referencing the PR that merged the standards for the GEP, not the original GEP issue, which isn't how the GEP's numbering works. None of us had really noticed, but it's now fixed. That was one of the other PRs. I found a couple more very small things that I'll be doing a PR about in the next couple of days, but that should be the only changes that merge between now and the final release, unless there is something seriously wrong. So yeah, there should be no more changes. The two sets of change notes we have already should be representative of what's going to be in the final release. As Rob said, the biggest change now is, aside from the additive changes that we talked about already in RC1, is removing the V1 Alpha 2 thing. Oh, and the other thing I wanted to call out here is the V1 Alpha generated code has not been removed from the repo yet. I wanted to wait until after this release, where so that if you are depending on that code, it will be it'll still be there. But soon after we release 1.2, I will come back and make another PR that will remove all of the V1 Alpha 2 code, like the generated code and the V1 Alpha 2 sources and stuff like that, because there's no reason to keep them around anymore. For that is for reference grant and gRPC, obviously, not for the other stuff that's still in V1 Alpha 2.
Yep. I think that's it for 1.2 then. So maybe Candace, looks like you're next. I completely agree with what I think you're going to say, but with that, I'll hand it off.
I only added this today because it's a light agenda. I don't expect that we're going to get through it today. But I just want to make sure that we don't forget about the gateway hierarchy brainstorming, or that I missed some update where we're done with this and we're not going back to it again. Just I assume that I know everything that's going on with it, but that's a bad assumption to make. So I mean, first of all, have we had any follow-ups since the summer on this one?
No,
So
not that I'm aware. Or go ahead,
not a
Dave.
lot, or there is a PR open to actually take listener set, like to open a gap for listener set as a was. I'm just looking at the open PRs, seeing if I can find it. Or maybe it's an issue, but there is some stuff open to move ahead with listener set. There we are. Yes, that was Dave, who is on the call. So here on that now, I'm just grabbing that now so I can put it in the chat. Yeah, so there is a version 2 of this with a proposal for listener set. I think to me, listener set as it stands was basically as far as I was concerned, it was ready to move to provisional. Looking at this issue, Rob, I think you wanted to follow up some more with some meetings. But I think the biggest change here is that if we move ahead with listener set, we'll need to make listeners optional, which people asked for before, but it is could conceivably be a breaking change.
Yeah, that's a big thing. I think we need more people here to talk about that, about making listeners optional.
Yeah.
I don't want to see that kind of like slipped under the rug, or I feel like it should be more carefully discussed. And I have some concerns about listener sets, but I'd rather, I mean, I couldn't enumerate them right now. I just wanted to get a status of where we are with this. And then finding out that we are making progress on listener set, maybe without the full debate that we normally have, is a little disappointing.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I think it was more. Yeah, I think, and Dave can probably correct me because he sort of speak for himself here to some extent too. But I think it was more that we wanted to try and move ahead with something because we were a bit stuck on debating, and so like having something that we could talk about more, is often a useful way to sort of get the conversation moving. The fact that I thought it was ready for provisional doesn't mean anything, right? Like I'm not the final arbiter here. The community as a whole is. But I'm more than happy to keep talking about it. But yeah, like I think that I would definitely like to see it keep moving forward, and I certainly have, for one, have not forgotten about it. So yeah, just to be clear, that's my sort of opinion here. Dave, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I haven't done anything since it didn't come in. It wasn't part of the release cut. So the way I viewed it is like it's been just on pause until people have cycles to debate it again.
I think, yeah, I think that's a good interpretation of it, but I think that pause has officially ended in the sense that we are, we've, other than a few formalities, we have effectively released 1.2. Let's say tomorrow, I don't know, whenever some combination of maintainers are online enough to get the release out. So immediately after that gets into scoping, and I think that is fair game for this discussion. It is a very big discussion, and I don't want to put you on the spot or anything. So if you just don't have bandwidth, or if you need help pushing it through, that's a good thing to call out. But don't definitely make noise. Try to if we can help set up some one-off meetings. I know we want to have some working sessions on this at KubeCon, but ideally, we've mostly figured things out by the time we get to KubeCon, uh, because this is such a huge topic. Um, and I know not everyone can make it to KubeCon too, so I don't want to rely too heavily on that single venue. Yeah, so maybe that's a long way of saying, Dave, do you still have time to push this one forward, and is it still interesting to you?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. What I guess let me look at the PR again. I guess maybe this is on me. I was very, I'm the one who ultimately said I didn't think it could squeeze into 1.2 because it was so large, and so it was just at the tail end of the cycle. Should we? I can't remember if there are any big unresolved open areas here, but maybe
I think
is
the
this
biggest
real?
unresolved thing is literally the optional listeners issue because, and the reason why that is currently sort of listed as an issue is because um, if we don't make listeners on the gateway optional and we do have listener set, then it becomes complicated to deal with. I mean, it's effectively a lot of people probably need to have like a dummy listener that doesn't do anything. I mean, we could definitely for something that's in provisional and experimental, that is a thing that we could move forward with and say like, if you are using listener set, then include this dummy one, right? This dummy thing and ignore it. It's okay to ignore this dummy, this dummy listener or something like that. Yeah.
I thought there were also plans to bring this API, even though it's not merged in, I think to SIG Network as a sanity check before we go down this road, in case they all of a sudden start,
Did
I don't
this?
know, like vetoing it again.
Did Rob? Did you discuss this as part of the API review?
No, I think I initially intended to, but I thought it would really deserve a session of its own. For
Mhm.
API review, all we did is we just block some time off on SIG Network. Their meetings have been pretty light recently, so it's pretty easy to just show up and get the TLs to give you feedback on things. I would recommend that's what we do as a close to next step here. If anyone can put together kind of like a high level summary that doesn't require everyone to read this, like maybe even just like 3 or 4 really basic slides instead of like trying to process the entire gap. And then it
Oh,
looks like we're a week and a half out from the next meeting.
a week and a half. Okay. So it's like next week sometime, or is it? No.
Yeah, it's the Thursday is at 9 Pacific, so an awful time for you.
Yeah,
Sadly.
Friday AM. Yeah. Yeah. So
What
yeah,
what what
I'm
day
out for
is
that
that?
next one. It's
Is it this week or the week after?
Next week. So what I'm seeing
Okay.
is October 10 at 9 Pacific, noon Eastern. I don't know.
Yeah, I can't make that one.
Awful
It's,
Australia.
Canadian Thanksgiving.
Yeah, I think it might need
Oh
to be the one
yeah.
up. I'm for me, I can't make that one either. I'm away. Yeah.
As a bit of trivia, I'm also traveling for Canadian Thanksgiving. So there you
No.
go. But yeah.
Okay.
Cool.
Well,
Okay.
so I think that it's probably fine I feel like it's probably fine for us to at least is actually worthwhile for us to talk a bit more about where we're at with this proposal. Candace, I'd definitely like to hear more about your concerns with it, with the overall listener set proposal. So I think if you could spend some time like writing up something there, maybe if you just put it at the bottom of the listener set doc, the Gateway hierarchy brainstorming doc, just say like, here's my problems with it. And we do some async sort of backwards and forwards inside that document. That might be a good way to sort of kick things off and get people's brains spooled back up on this thing. I know my brain will take a little bit to recover all the context. And more review on the PR would be great as well. I think doing a SIGNet, sort of an early SIGNet review is a good idea. I would definitely like to come to that one. I'm probably happy to do the slides as well once we have arrived on what we want to actually say. But I don't want to make them now and be the guy who's like, this is what I think, when I know that people have like objections. So I'd want to make sure that everyone has a chance to sort of contribute feedback before we start like saying this is what we're going to take and have a chat to SIG Network about. So I think we should move ahead with doing that. So Candace, if you want to add your stuff in there, and then we can all review the PR and revisit the document, so that we're all sort of got context recovered, all those of us who are interested in it, and that way we can move forward a bit. I mean, and again, to go back to like why I'm interested here, like I have got a lot of feedback from people that one of the biggest things that people want is a way to be able to delegate down certificate ownership to people who are running apps, right? Like they want to be able to split out the certificate owner part of the Gateway API personas and give that permission to application developers. When we were originally building this, we were like, well, we don't even want to do that. That's an infrastructure job. But there are definitely people who want to do that. And a lot of people are being poorly served by those people are being poorly served by the API at this point. So that's a large part of the reason why gateway merging or listener sets or something like that is useful, because we do not want to putting certificates on HTTP route is not viable for other reasons, which again, I needed some time to recover the context there, but we talked about that a lot, and it created a whole bunch of other problems. That I probably don't want to relitigate that unless we absolutely have to. I think having the TLS config be tightly bound to the thing that defines the port, the listener, does make a lot of sense. And so that's why I'm leaning in that direction. Candice, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I'll take another look at the document and try to come up with some more, something in writing. That I just feel like it's very complicated for what we actually wanted to do with gateway hierarchy. It's a very complicated change. I'm not really sure that we should push it. I know we're not pushing it through for anything soon, but I would like to make sure that everybody weighs in. I mean, every implementer's got a chance to weigh in. Other implementers get a chance to weigh in on adding so many new things to the SPAC and making listeners optional. I think one of the main concerns that I had to do with DNS, in terms of merging listeners, and so this doesn't solve the problem that I was thinking of.
Is that about the ownership of DNS and like who gets to claim the domain? the host name and things like that?
Well, yes, and if there's listeners that merge that have a shared host name, or, if
okay.
listeners would merge otherwise, if they didn't have a difference in host names or something like that. So that was one of the concerns. I didn't necessarily see it addressed in the
I think
document.
actually you have reminded me of a thing that I said I was going to do that I haven't done yet, which is to go back over the documentation about distinct listeners and like clarify that a bit. Yeah, if you could, thanks for adding that. Yeah, I will do that. I have a plan for how to update that language around distinct. That
Okay.
once we've cut the 1.2 release, I'd like to go back and do. So that maybe that's a thing there to sort of update that language around distinct to try and make it a bit clearer. Because I think if we can have a better and clearer idea of what distinct listeners mean, then it may make the conversation about listener sets a bit easier. Because then you can say all listeners in a listener set must be distinct, right? Is what I'm aiming for, right? Like, and as long as distinct is meaningful to people, then that would be a reasonably straightforward way to sort of clarify some of the things that could be problems.
Okay.
Yeah.
Also, Candace, to your question about like the actual ownership delegation and like who gets to manage it. I think there was a comment thread. I don't know. It might have been on this doc. It might have been on a different doc, basically saying like this is an open question, or like this is an open problem. We don't have a right solution to it yet. We might need to work actually upstream in SIG networking Kubernetes to figure this out. But like, I think it was a question of like, I don't know if it's in scope or not, but it was recognized as like this is a concrete problem that is worth solving somewhere, somehow.
Your speech was a little bit garbled for me.
Sorry.
I think yeah, it was a little garbled for me too, but I think what you may have been referring to is a lot of the solutions in here were saying that domain delegation was kind of intentionally not solved or attempted. And I think what we're talking about is domain delegation.
Yeah, I think that's it.
But somehow we claimed that, or I claimed, or whoever wrote this, I think I may have been the one who claimed that, oh yeah, listener set totally solves this. And what I'm hearing from Candace is it actually doesn't. So it'd be good to get that feedback and like, why doesn't it solve it? And what, what are the gaps? Because I believe you. I believe there are things that this is not solving. So yeah, just maybe leave a comment on PR or wherever. But
Yeah,
yeah,
but like
so go ahead.
I was just going to wrap it up with like Nick said, it does depend on how we define distinct in terms of listener merging. We have some gaps in the definition, I think, at this point. DNS names being one of them.
Yeah, I think the biggest gap is that, yeah, like that it's not new. I think there are rules there that I think cover basically all the use cases, but I don't think it clearly says that these cover. The language is not clear. Like I think that the rules that we have there do cover basically all the use cases you could think of, but I think that the way that it's written, it's not clear that they're rules. If that's like, yeah, like when I originally wrote that, I think I had a clear set of rules in mind, and I think they're not actually that badly articulated, but it's not clear that this is actually not just a suggestion. This is like a rule. And so
that's what I remember
and so that's part of the clarification, is to sort of take the language and make it clearer that this is definitely part of the specification. This is what distinct means, and here's specifically what it means for all of the supported, like the Gateway API included supported protocols. I didn't want to be too too sort of normative to still allow for adding more protocols later. But I think that the gain in clarity is probably better than originally. That's why I wasn't specific and said for TCP, this is what it means. For HTTP, this is what it means. For TLS, this is what it means. For TLS, for each of the protocols that's supported, like I will be specific about exactly what distinct means. I think the rules are there, but they're not like explicitly laid out. And I think that if there's anything that I have learned about writing a spec for this long is that you can never be too explicit when you're writing a specification like this, because it's very easy to misread something. So yeah, I will take that item. That's why I have put my name against it there. Once this merges, I will once we release 1.2. First thing I will do is try and open a PR to do this language clarification, and so I will ping that in the main. I'm sort of going to be a bit unavailable. I'm away this weekend, and then the weekend after. So the week after, I've got a short week, and then I'm at like a offsite the week after that, where I'll sort of be limited availability. So I want to make sure I'll open that as quickly as possible once we release 1.2, so that we've got plenty of time to talk about it while I'm sort of only lightly available. But yeah, hopefully then by sort of around the end of sort of mid to end of October, we should be able to we should have agreement, and then this PR should hopefully merge sometime in the next few weeks, and then that will be able to make the discussion about gateway hierarchy a bit clearer, I think.
Cool.
Okay.
I have a
Thank you.
quick question. What do folks think? It's kind of like testing the waters. What do folks think about a separate resource for doing the domain kind of like ownership and delegation?
Yeah, I mean, that's
sorry to qualify, that could be used outside of Gateway API for other things, because it is sort of like common that, hey, if the gateway could use it, there could be other apps or platform specific things that could also read that domain hierarchy tree to infer stuff about workloads in a namespace and things like that.
I know Costin, and when he was more involved in this project, was that I can imagine he would have loved that idea. I think he may have suggested something similar. So yeah, no, I think that's worth exploring. Assuming we understand the requirements we're trying to solve for. The unfortunate thing is that I think anything you do of that nature almost certainly needs to be cluster scoped and not namespace scoped. And I know from previous
Strong
experience
resistance.
that anytime we do a cluster scoped anything, it's very unpopular. So, gateway class V2, yeah, not exactly, but just another cluster scope thing that people won't find.
I mean, the problem is that that host names themselves are effectively cluster scoped, especially for Ingress, right? And so necessarily, if you're going to have a thing that describes them, then it needs to be cluster scoped. You can't break it down and put it in some namespace where it's not visible there, the whole cluster. Like if you're going to have some sort of domain delegation thing, it has to be like RBAC. Like, you need to have like cluster roles, essentially. You need to have cluster domains or something like that available in order to be able to make this whole thing work. If you don't, then it's going to be very difficult to be able to build a tree when things might, not everybody will be able to see it.
So what's interesting is I feel like I disagree, because you could have different domain trees on the same cluster that have different gateways servicing different domain trees.
Sure, but if you're breaking up the config to allow host names to live in any namespace, then all namespaces need to know about what namespaces own what host names, right? Like, do you see what I'm saying? Like yes, you can have separate
You
trees.
need a reference back up the tree. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes.
Rather, you're saying if it's all open and then you don't know what it attaches to. Yeah, I was actually thinking of having specific like references to potentially even cluster scope, or if not cluster scope, then just in a specific namespace, maybe.
Yeah.
But yeah,
I mean, you can make the cluster scope thing be small. Just a record. A record that a domain is in use in the cluster and that you need to go looking for things or something. But once you have a cluster scope object like that, is probably more, you are acting at cluster scope. And so it makes more sense RBAC wise to have something that requires people to have cluster scope permissions to mess with it. Because if the thing acts at cluster scope, then whoever is editing it should have permissions to act at cluster scope. I think all of this comes back to the fact that one of the biggest problems we were designing around with Ingress is that Ingress is a namespaced object with a cluster scoped field, right? Like the host name field in Ingress is cluster scoped, right? Like, you can create ingresses in any namespace that use the same that have the same ingress controller, that have the same ingress class, that use the same host name, and the expected behavior is that those ingresses will basically be merged, right? Like, so generally, but because that's what Ingress Nginx does. That was never specified, but the expected behavior is what Ingress Nginx does, and that's what Ingress Nginx does. Is it merges hostname related config from multiple namespaces. Is that very complicated? Oh yeah. Is it guaranteed to blow up in someone's face? Yes, that's one of the main reasons why we want to do something about this in Gateway API. But yeah, then we come back to the fact that that is a cluster scope field, right? Like, the whole cluster needs to know that somebody has claimed that host name. So I think it's probably, to be honest, I actually think it's probably the best argument that I can think of to have a cluster scoped object. But as Rob said, there has been a lot of resistance to having cluster scoped objects because some people don't like people having to have cluster wide permissions for anything. Full stop, end of story. So like whatever we do here, like we need to understand and respect that some people are like no cluster scoped objects, full stop, or minimal cluster. If you're gonna force us to have them, then we're gonna figure out ways around it. Which is what we've had happen with gateway class, where people are basically saying, "Oh, I'm just not going to create the gateway class, but if you use the gateway class string I expect, then I'll pick it up." And again, the reason for that was that the gateway classes are effectively cluster scoped, even if you don't want there to be an object that describes them as cluster scope, because you have a controller that needs to look across the whole cluster, or at least some defined subset of namespaces. But there is no concept of a set of namespaces in Kubernetes at the moment, so you have either namespace scope or cluster scope. Yeah. So yeah, thank you for letting me rant about that.
Yeah, no, I mean that's a good follow-up. I mean, I would love to see someone like dig into that a bit further, sketch it out, see how annoyed people are at the idea of something like that would involve at least a portion of the solution being a cluster scoped resource. But yeah. Related topic. Well, are we done in gateway hierarchy, or any last? Okay, cool. Related topic. Lior put this together. I was actually going to do this on my own, but thanks, Lior. Basically, these are the areas I think, for the folks that are going to be able to make it to KubeCon this fall, I would love to have these kind of like working sessions that are focused on these different topics. I've obviously been pretty interested in this LLM routing thing. I anticipate that being a bunch of working groups serving folks and anyone else that might be interested. But yeah, these are the things that I've got top of mind. Apparently Lior does too, so that's great. But if there are other topics that you want to make sure we have a session for at KubeCon, and this is when I describe session, I basically mean a bunch of people that are interested get together somewhere in the conference and talk about it. Nothing formal at all about this. Just getting the people that care the most about a topic to have a space to talk about something like that. That's it. So
And
yeah.
At LinuxConf and other sort of older school open source projects, they call it a BOF session, right? Like a birds of a feather.
Yes, yeah.
Just like
Yeah.
people who are interested in a subject getting together and talking about it while they're all in person.
Yeah, good call.
Given that we're going to do our best to make
ahead.
sure that there's a note stock for any discussions there and all that sort of stuff, so that we can bring make sure that discussion gets propagated back to the wider community. You have a note taker and all that sort of stuff. I don't think it's really practical to record because we'll probably be in a noisy room somewhere.
Yeah. I don't know. The very first session that Gateway API started with was like impossible to hear everyone because it was in like the vendor hall or something. I don't know. So yeah, possibility of hearing people. I mean, the past few times we've done these in contributor lounge, which has been pretty good, I think, but still not perfect. With that, Arco, you're up next. I think you've got the last item on the list.
Thanks, Rob. So yeah, this is about GEP 1762, which introduces the notion of the infrastructure field inside gateways, which allows you to attach a arbitrary resource, parameters ref, to it. Along with that, it also sort of adds a few lines, one of them being if you are provisioning a resource, taking into account the infrastructure field, then you must provision the generated resource in the same namespace as the gateway. And for implementations like Envoy Gateway, we don't have access to write into that gateway namespace field. So we write these resources like deployments and services into a special infrastructure namespace field. And so I'm just curious to hear what everybody thinks about the must here, and if there is any scope to reduce the enforcement from a must to a should.
It looks like, you know, unless I'm just missing it entirely, it looks like this requirement is only in the gap and not actually even in the, like, it doesn't look like it made it to the spec, despite us adding the fields to the spec. So that seems to mean it something that got lost in translation here.
Yeah.
Usually if we have any must, they need to be in the spec for them to actually matter. I
And
don't really know.
see, so this is, I mean, this ties to the fact that a new conformance test was added, right, for the infrastructure. And that actually checks for a specific label on the generated resources. And that label only has a gateway name field, right? But if you generate a resource in another namespace field, then you would care about the name and the namespace resource to avoid labels to avoid collisions.
Yeah.
So that's why these two are related, and I just wanted to get clarification on this before we moved on to the
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think
and
that. So you go, Rob.
to clarify, I don't, you know, one of the things I'm coming at this from a completely different angle, and that's that I don't, the controller I represent is not generating any resources in Kubernetes. Everything's just completely outside of the cluster. So this would be too prescriptive for my implementation too, but in a very different way. So I am open to loosening this doing something here. It is strange that we missed something in translating from gap to spec. And I do want to, you know, call that out.
Yeah, I mean,
Conformance is a big deal. So I think that conformance test is very much targeting, you know, in cluster implementations. And so I'm like, okay, sure, I get that. Envoy Gateway needing to push things in an entirely different namespace seems okay to me. Like, I don't know that we need to prevent that from happening. I feel like it's
yeah. So I think it comes down to the reason why we had this as must is we wanted it to be that, that if you're generating resources, you should be able to find them, right? Like you should be able to find them easily, right? Like you should be able to, yeah, you should know from the gateway, like where you're going to find any resources that are generated by the gateway. I guess the question I would have for you, Arco, does that mean that like when user creates a gateway and they might not, would they not be able to see the generated resources that the Envoy Gateway is creating for them because they're in a different namespace? Like depending
Yeah,
on
so
our background?
it would depend on so the platform admin would have access who has some rights on the infrastructure namespace. It's Envoy Gateway system namespace, and then they can fetch that using an owning name and an owning namespace, gateway owning name, gateway owning namespace label.
Yeah, so I guess, I mean, at the end of the day, like, it's not going to strongly affect, like, the functionality will be available. What I'm worried about is that, like, it would be pretty straightforward to get yourself into a situation where the person who owns the gateway can't, they don't have read RBAC to that namespace, because that's an infrastructure namespace. They shouldn't have, there's stuff in there they shouldn't see, right? Like, but that means that then they won't be able to look at the stuff that represents their own things, so that it could make troubleshooting harder unless we're very careful about the stuff and making sure everything that they need gets propagated onto the gateway itself, which brings us back to having to update status a lot. So I mean, I guess that's why that is currently a must, is to make that dereferencing operation like cheap and easy. If the stuff needs to be created in the same namespace as the owning gateway, then then that's a much easier sort of thing to conceptually understand. If we do change this to should, then we have to have a whole set of rules around, like, how do you ensure that there's a breadcrumb trail from the gateway to the created resources that live in some other namespace, and how do you make sure you tell the platform owner that if they're going to do things this way, then you need to make sure that the people who are creating gateways have read access to the things that to the things that they're to the things that their gateway has had created for them, right? Because you should be able to see the stuff that your gateway creation request has created. I don't think that's that unreasonable. So it's just, if we're going to do that, then it's not just changing that should, it's also writing a whole set of other guidelines about, like, if you do that, like, then you need to add the namespace label, because now the gateway can cross namespaces, and when you do that, you need to do this and you need to do that, and the conformance test will need to be updated that to make sure that it handles that case. So yeah, over to you, Aka.
Rob, do you want to go first? Okay, I'll go.
Oh, sure. Thanks. Just real quick. Yeah, like Nick suggested, the namespace label seems like it's a solution that works here regardless. Like, you can modify this list to look at all namespaces instead of the local namespace, and you can, change the label selector to do gateway name and gateway namespace, and, not. I don't have a strong opinion here on whether or not these resources, the resources that are generated by a gateway, need to live inside the same namespace. It feels fine to me if they're not. Like, I see the argument for that. So but I get what you're saying, Nick. Like, you absolutely need to be able to find, like, the whole point of this is to be able to find those resources. But since kubectl, client go, etc., all make it fairly easy to find any resource in any namespace, as long as it has a set of labels that you understand, I feel like that's okay. I don't know. I'll hand it off. I think Arco, you're next.
Yeah, so just I think responding to the points Nick and Robbie raised. So I think I am more inclined to making it should, and by default not enforcing it. And then the way you find it, like you already mentioned, is you could have a gateway namespace field. So you could add another layer if you want to find it in a separate namespace. And this just means that Envoy Gateway will choose to deploy in an infrastructure namespace by default, because it wants to it wants to run with lesser privileges by default, and there'll probably be a knob where you can enable where you can write into a gateway. So there'll be a separate deployment mode, and that's where we may just support running in the same namespace, but we may not choose to run that way by default.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Why would we not, like, the thing is, if we just require a must here that says you need to set not just gateway name, but also gateway namespace or whatever, then it can be in the same namespace or not and still pass conformance tests.
Yeah.
That seems like, and then you don't need to have I guess this specific requirement of that it must be in the same namespace is just something we remove entirely. I don't even know that you need a should for that. I think
think
the real requirement that
I think should there is just
the real
about
requirement that we want here is just that these resources can be easily discoverable, and the way they can be discoverable is by looking up resources with these labels, right? That's it. And then I don't know. Sorry, Nick, I cut you off.
Yeah, that's fine. Fine. I was interrupting you. So yeah, like I think it's probably fine to I would prefer to leave the should there to give people encouragement that like that's easier, right? Like that's easier for your end user to put the generated resources in the same namespace. Like if you want to, I think that Arco's point about like controller permissions is pretty fair. That sometimes people want to run their controller with a very limited set of permissions. I think practically, it's going to be difficult to do that because like permissions that do Gateway API almost certainly will need to have read access to secrets in a wide swath of the cluster, if not the whole cluster, because unless you are constraining via list of namespaces, and saying only certs in these namespaces are valid references or something, but a lot of people want to be able to reference certs in any namespace, so your controller needs to be able to read certs in any namespace. To be able to do, ironically enough, the thing that controllers actually need in this case to have least privileges is the referential authorization cap, because that is specifically designed to grant permission to controllers based on the objects that are actually relevant to them. That's what that cap is about. Is making it so that there is a way to say, my controller needs to read secrets that are referenced in a gateway, and to have the gateway API and to have the API server at a Kubernetes level be able to say, okay, I understand how to like build relationships between things to some extent. There's some standard way to do this with these referential authorization objects that you can say like, that a gateway API implementation can say, oh, I have a gateway. Now I've created an object that says I need access to the secret that's called this in this namespace. And the API server is like, oh, okay, I trust you because you've been given this other super thing that says you're allowed to request access, and so you've requested access to this, that meets the requirements around the access. Therefore I'm going to allow you to read that secret. But then you don't need to specifically give access to all secrets in the cluster to your Gateway API implementation. Like, ironically enough, that cap is solving the same problem here, which is about making sure that you have least required permissions for the things that for implementations that implement this API. I think it's a very interesting discussion, and so Arco, I think it is a classic case of one of those you turn over the rock and you're like, oh man, there's a whole nother rock under here. And to see how far down these rocks go, right? Like, so yeah, I think I really appreciate you bringing this up, Arco. I think it's probably fine for us to do the should, but like I said, to do that work, we just need to be careful that we're making that I think that we absolutely need to mandate via a conformance test that there is discoverability of generated resources, right? And so I think having a conformance test to validate that there is discoverability of generated resources is not negotiable, right? Like that we have to do. Exactly what that conformance test tests, that is negotiable. Right now we have it has to be in the same namespace. I get that. And this is exactly where the other thing that we've been talking about with giving like conformance tests like reliability levels is going to be useful, because that way we can mark the signaling testability, being able to mark this test as like a provisional test and having it be okay to skip the provisional tests would be pretty useful.
Yeah, that's exactly where I was going to go with this. I think Arco, since you're particularly affected by this, if you want to, in the next 24 hours, drop a PR that takes this conformance test and sets provisional to true, I would be very supportive of that. I think that we do have enough open questions around exactly how we're doing it. I think it just got missed in this PR where Mattia initially added the the set of conformance tests we think are provisional. I think this one is a good candidate for that. Fortunately, since the problematic line you called out is not actually in the spec, I don't think we need to change the spec right now. I would just say that, yeah, as long as we call this test out as provisional, I think that's a change that one of the very few changes I would be okay with between RC2 and this final release. But that's just me.
Awesome. Thanks, Rob. Nick, I'll go ahead and make this provisional change, and I'll start a longer discussion in the same GitHub issue about the things you raised. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks. All right. Well, I think we've hit the end of our meeting. Thank you, everyone. Any last comments?
I just wanted to note that Philip asked some questions in the chat about certificates and namespace scope and cluster scope issues. Philip, can I ask you to ask that question again in Slack so we don't lose it from the Zoom chat?
Yeah.
It's probably good to take this one async. Thanks everybody as well
I'll definitely
for
put it in Slack.
Yeah, great. And thanks everybody as well for lots of discussion today. For a session where we had a reasonably light agenda, we ended up using the whole time. So thank you.
Yeah, good time. All right, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.